One day, my wife Jessica came to me with a question. It started when she noticed something in my eyes when I was looking at her mother, Nancy. I tried to avoid eye contact when Nancy was around, but Jessica noticed it twice and decided to argue with me. She asked me directly, and I tried to brush it off as nonsense, but she wouldn't give up until she had an answer. Fine, I thought, and decided to just answer her the way I wanted to. Jessica looked at me carefully, waved her hand dismissively, and left to the other room, closing the door behind her. I was left alone, pondering the situation. What had made her suspect something? Nothing had changed in our lives, except for one thing. Nancy started visiting us more often. I usually only saw her on big holidays, but lately she'd been coming more often, sitting in the kitchen with Jessica, chatting and whispering, so I wouldn't hear, and then giggling softly. I'd walk in, and they'd fall silent, as if I had nothing better to do than lurk around my own apartment. Nancy was sitting in a short dress, trying to look younger than her years. She was succeeding. Her legs were still in good shape, but I couldn't help but notice the way she was looking at me, as if studying me. I didn't know what she was thinking. Then one day, she fingertipped me to come closer. I was stunned. Nancy was usually strict with me, never joking. We always talked only about practical things. She was an attractive woman, with many men claiming her attention, but no one would ever know what I thought of her. And yet, here she was, calling me closer. I swallowed hard, my t-shirt sticking to me as I took a hesitant step, then another. Her lips opened slightly as I leaned toward her, trembling slightly before I kissed her and stroked her leg. Nancy responded, and that's when I heard the front door slam. Jessica had come home. I jumped back. My nerves were on edge. But Jessica acted as if nothing had happened. She didn't say a word. Nancy was stirring sugar in a cup of tea, calm as ever. I sat in front of the TV for a while, and then left the room, feeling the frustration building inside me. Before we went to bed, Jessica winked at me and asked, "Do you want my mom, Ryan?" I wanted to snap back, but held my tongue. After a few days, things seemed to calm down. But then I heard Nancy calling my name, and without thinking, I went to her. She looked at me, and I moved closer, beginning to undo the buttons of her blouse. She helped me, as if this was all perfectly normal. I was nervous. Jessica could walk in at any moment. But Nancy was calm, as if she knew exactly how much time we had. When they finished talking, Nancy sat with Jessica for a little while longer, sipping coffee, and then left. The day went on as usual. No hints or comments from Jessica until bedtime. She came out of the bathroom and asked, "Do you want my mom, Ryan?" I blushed, trying to keep my composure. Jessica smiled enigmatically, turned her back to me, and fell asleep. A few days later, Nancy came again. I tensed up, but Jessica immediately left, saying she had to go to a friend's house right away. I didn't argue. Nancy didn't need to call me this time, and I went to her willingly. I was calm, confident. She and Jessica were clearly up to something, but I couldn't figure out what. And frankly, I didn't care. I loved it. Nancy knew exactly when to call it a day, always just before Jessica returned. Whenever Nancy came over, Jessica would excuse herself to leave, and I would be alone with Nancy. I couldn't help but wonder if they were conspiring against me, but it worked. Nancy and I grew closer, and my relationship with her improved dramatically. Before all this started, I'd had a girlfriend on the side, Nothing serious, just a distraction. But now I didn't need anyone else. I had Jessica, and I had Nancy. Maybe that was their plan, to keep me on track. If so, it worked. It might have seemed strange from the outside, but no one had any idea what went on behind closed doors. And I have to admit, I felt like a winner. I didn't have to spend money on a friend, and my wife had more money for the family budget. Nancy never expected gifts or anything like that. It was wonderful, in a perverse sort of way. It went on like this for several weeks, and each time Nancy came over, I felt more and more comfortable around her. Our encounters became more and more passionate, and I looked forward to those moments when we were alone together. I began to notice little things about her, the way she smiled when she was being mischievous, the way she subtly touched my arm when no one else was around. There was a kind of high in the mystery of it all, and I began to crave it. Our relationship with Nancy grew into something beyond anything I had ever imagined. We talked for hours, not just about Jessica or mundane topics, but about deeper things, our fears, our pasts, our dreams. It was strange, but there was a connection between us that I hadn't felt before. Jessica seemed to enjoy this dynamic too. She would wink at me or smile slyly when Nancy was around, as if participating in a joke I didn't quite understand. Sometimes I thought she took some satisfaction in knowing that her mother and I were involved. It was a strange arrangement, but it seemed to suit us all. One afternoon, Nancy came over while Jessica was at work. She called me beforehand and asked if I would be home. I agreed, and when she came over, there was no hesitation. We hugged as soon as she walked through the door. The tension between us was building, and it was getting harder and harder to keep our hands off each other. We moved into the living room, and I felt a rush of excitement at the thought of being caught. There was something interesting about the risk, and it made every touch, every kiss even more exciting. Afterward, we sat on the couch, catching our breath. Nancy was looking at me with a tenderness in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "You know," she said, "I never thought it could happen between us. But I'm glad it did." I nodded, not knowing what to say. I felt the same way, but some part of me still couldn't believe what was happening. It was all like a dream that I didn't want to wake up from. Later that evening, Jessica came home, and Nancy had already left. Jessica seemed to know exactly what had happened. She didn't say anything directly, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. When we sat down to dinner, she leaned over to me and whispered, "Did you have fun tonight, Ryan?" Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but smile. It was clear that whatever game we were playing, we were all committed to it. As the days went by, I reflected on how much things had changed. My relationship with Jessica had always been good, but it lacked the excitement I was feeling now with Nancy. It wasn't that I loved Jessica less, on the contrary, I felt closer to her now than I had in years. It was as if this strange arrangement had brought us together in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The tension, the secrecy, the thrills, it had all become part of our lives, and I couldn't imagine things going back to the way they were. Women are so cunning. I would never have thought of such a plan to eliminate a rival. And yet, here we were, and everyone seemed happier than before. It was unconventional, but it worked for us. And maybe that's all that mattered.